A very good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I'd like to thank the Chulalongkorn University and the Asian University Alliance for inviting me to speak at this very important conference. I'd like also to thank Professor Wasana Wongsurawat and Dr. Michiko Yoshida for the kind invite. I'd like also to take this opportunity to extend a word of welcome to our colleagues from Myanmar who are able to join us today. I would like to spend the next 30 minutes or so speaking on something that is close to my heart, the topic of my talk, Chinese migration and the shaping of the multicultural Southeast Asia, deals with a topic that's also reflective of my own family's experience. I'm a fifth generation Chinese in Malaysia. My forefathers came to at the turn of the 20th century and settled down in what was then known as the British North Borneo, or present-day Sabah. During the course of growing up, I went to a Chinese school for my primary education, and then to a national type school that was run by a Christian missionary society for my secondary, or what is known as high school education. In this high school, lessons were taught in Malay and in English. As I was attending the school, I noticed that many of my friends who had Chinese names, but were not Chinese. Although they do look like Chinese, they were not Chinese. They were given different types of identifications. But there were also other friends who were not Chinese, but could speak fluent Chinese. This, of course, was the result of active mixed marriages that was common in a place like Sabah. As I moved over to West Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur, my perspective of the Chinese community also enriched by a different experience of the Chinese there. One whose relations with other ethnic groups were much more absolute and allow very little interaction or inter-ethnic interactions, let alone inter-ethnic marriages. So in the case of Sabah just now, we could see that the lines that separate ethnic groups were somewhat blurred and allowed many to cross the line and to allow mixed marriages, but not the case in West Malaysia and in the peninsula and in Kuala Lumpur. But like the Chinese in Sabah, they also live side by side with people of other ethnic groups. As I began to read and study on the history of the Chinese community, my perspective on the past experience of the Chinese, both in Malaysia and elsewhere, were often seen through my own personal experience. This, of course, is a limited vision or perspective. It is reflective, perhaps, of what is deemed to be a second phase of Chinese migration. Literature tells us that there was an earlier phase of migration which provided a somewhat different experience from that of my families, as well as the thousands of Chinese who originated from the migration process. And this migration process started much earlier in history, as you can see in this outline, but of which some of its influences are still visible even today. So my talk is divided into two parts based on a linear line arranged chronologically, each devoted to a phase of Chinese migration to Southeast Asia. The first traces the migration process from an earlier period that lasted from right until about the 15th century, and then it slowed down, almost coming to an end by the 19th century. And the phase two starts with the mid-19th century, when Western imperialism brought about a new phase of Chinese migration. So this paper will focus on how these two phases of Chinese migration have impacted or contributed to the shaping of multicultural perspective in Southeast Asia and in Southeast Asian history. Perhaps it would be good to take a look at what we deem as multicultural perspective. Multicultural perspective, or some people will say that this is multiculturalism, is very much today a construct of the state. It is also consciously promoted by international organizations such as the United Nations, EU, ASEAN, and even different countries. So you can see all the happy faces here in Malaysia promoting the idea of Malaysia truly Asia. So you have these children wearing this different costume that you can find common in Malaysia to say that we actually represent not just one group of people, but we have great diversity. The same theme can be found at the right-hand bottom corner. You can see that this is Indonesia Raya, celebrating the diversity of Indonesian in the way of the different ethnic groups. Same with the Philippines, right on top of this right-hand corner. You can see that the Philippines also highlighted the different ethnic groups. In the middle, you can see that Southern Thailand, the promoting harmonious society, and also to highlight the diversity, where you can find a Muslim Haji was actually bringing a monk on his treasure. And here on the left-hand side, left-hand corner, you can actually see United Nations, UNESCO poster promoting children of their own homeland, what they deem as their homeland, as they put them onto writings or onto drawings. And you can see that you can have a lot of workshops, seminars, and so on, all talking about multiculturalism or multicultural societies and so on. So this is a very important theme that we are exploring today in today's conference. And as we look down to further into this multicultural perspective, we can see that in earlier history, there was no concerted efforts or by design to bring about or to develop multicultural society. But somehow, certain processes in history brought about this multicultural facet. For instance, we have great diversity in terms of ethnicity and culture and religion in early Southeast Asia. So if you go back to Southeast Asian history, you find this region is full of diversity. The diversity that existed in Southeast Asia, early Southeast Asia, often being superseded by a state or even empires that promoted certain level of monolith culture, depending on who this particular or which ethnic group that actually dominating this particular kingdom or this particular empire. So culture, laws, and even religion were promoted based on certain understanding. So usually it will be a more monolith kind of culture and not multicultural perspective. And the coming of Western imperialism and colonialism reconfigured the perspective on the ground. More people, including the Chinese, were being brought in and adding further to the multicultural perspective. And what about multicultural perspective if we explore further in history? What about we scholars? More often than not, many scholars in the past labored for the state and therefore less inclined to look into the past via a multicultural perspective. This was especially true in young nations that were coming up, where there was a need to promote certain agenda, certain national agenda. And therefore, the state actually dictate the direction of what we are supposed to discuss, or at least the perspective will not be so much on the multicultural perspective. And we are thankful to Professor Prasenjit Duara, who in 1995 in his groundbreaking work suggests that we should rescue histories from the state. Now, of course, he was talking about the situation in China, the question of nationalism, the state vis-a-vis the people, how they behave, and so on in the past. But although this was a case in China, perhaps you can also take a leaf of Prof. Duara's idea and to develop it further. We will do this as the topic of my talk has suggested that we will do this via the long process of Chinese migration to Southeast Asia. Throughout history, in Asia, in Southeast Asia, we find that Chinese migration to the region was a recurring, if not a constant development. We always find the Chinese coming down to the region. And this paper argues that Chinese migration to the region helped to provide a multicultural perspective to our understanding of the history of the region. Whether it is through the Chinese interaction with the indigenous community, some even assimilated, but also continue to be a community itself within the larger framework of Southeast Asia, within the nation state, within the different empires and so on. One could still find that the Chinese actually contributed to our understanding of multicultural perspective. So it is crucial for us historians to be conscious of the fact that Chinese have contributed to the shaping of a multicultural Southeast Asia. So let us now go into first one of my discussion, the early Chinese migration. Asian history is filled with stories of human movement. Early times, you saw people traversing land and sea for various reasons, some in pursuit of trade, others in search of greener pastures, yet others were forced to leave their homeland in search of refuge and safety. Among those who were on the move were the Chinese. And the Chinese have been visitors to the region of Southeast Asia since very early times. And the various Chinese history have indicated that the Chinese venture abroad for different purposes. So in the case of Vietnam, we remember that Vietnam was under the Chinese rule from the 111 BCE right till 938 AD. We saw a conquest of people by the Chinese, but in the process, Chinese also emigrated to the region. And of course, Vietnam was governed as a commandery. And then later, you also find other types of Chinese coming down to the region. So even in the case of Myanmar, we can also see that there were also Chinese coming down through overland, and successive Chinese dynasties have sent armies to pacify, for instance, what they call pacifying the Shan state and so on. And each of these expeditions and long-term interactions had inevitably saw many Chinese move and settle in the new areas. And their numbers grew, and their lands and in these new lands, and their influences were also growing. Other than coming with the conquering army, there were also those who came to trade. So Chinese traders' presence in Southeast Asia during the 10th and the 12th century were well known, and in his groundbreaking work, The Nine High Trade, Professor Wang Gungwu documented adventures of the early Chinese seafarers and their trading ships, their journeys, and the ports that they visited became clear, and the goods that they were trading in. While some of these early Chinese could have stayed on for many years in the different ports and so on, their numbers remain small and temporal. Detail was mentioned about the existence of Chinese settlements during this period. If they have existed, they were temporal in nature. Buddhist learning center in the region like Srivijaya could have attracted Chinese monks and believers to come to these places. But again, they would be temporal and would not stay after the completion of their tasks. And the Chinese at this period were mainly transcending in nature. But we can see that there were different outcomes of this kind of interaction. So you can find that, for instance, the Chinese actually, although they have intermarried with the Vietnamese, and therefore a lot of the Vietnamese culture expression were actually akin to the Chinese cultural expression. But we can also see that even in the 12th century, 12th, 13th century, in the Khmer kingdom of Angkor, Zhao Ruguo actually mentioned the existence of Chinese community in that region. In Sukhothai, in the Menam Chao Phraya, in the 13th to 15th century, as well as later in Ayutthaya, we find that there were Chinese communities being mentioned. So you can see that in these pictures, we find these Chinese having left behind different kind of settlements. Some of them survived, some of them did not. And the Zhenghe voyages, the Admiral Zhenghe voyages that came down 7 times to the region also brought with them different group of Chinese who also set up different Chinese settlements. For instance, in Malacca, in different parts of the Straits of Malacca, you find Chinese settlements being established. Some of them were garrisoned in nature, but later on, some of them actually, some of these Chinese actually settled down and interacted with the local people. And the Chinese continue to remain in this region, and the evidence of their existence could be seen from various types of evidence that they have left behind. For instance, one very good example would be the dead scabs, where we find cemeteries. Early Chinese cemeteries would be very good evidence of showing how the Chinese have continued to come down to the region. So in Malaysia, in Malacca, for instance, we find in Bukit China, the Chinese have continued to bury their dead. And these could be found on the maps, Western maps as well. And in the case of Batavia and also in Manila, you also find a lot of old Chinese cemeteries that dates back from very early time, from the Spanish time, from the Dutch time. Even in Bangkok itself, one could see somewhere near Silom, you find some of these Chinese cemeteries that dates back to very early times. Other than that, in Malacca, for instance, we find the masjid. There are masjid or mosques that were actually shaped like Chinese buildings, and also you have the this very old temple that was built in the 17th century, and these are evidence that the Chinese continue to actually coming to the region and continue to settle down in the region, although their numbers must be very small. And during this period, we also find that the Chinese there were times that they were accepted. There were also times when they were not. So, for instance, in Manila, we find that the Chinese were massacred at some point in 1603, where more than 10,000 of them were executed. Then in Batavia, something similar happened in 1740s. And this, again, was a very interesting recurring theme. They were accepted, but yet sometimes they were not. And during the course of interactions, we began to find that this interaction began to bring about a different kind of outcome. The one which I alluded to just now in the introduction about some of my friends who were of mixed marriages, the results of mixed marriages. So we find different communities that were of mixed parentage between the indigenous people here and also the Chinese who came down. So in Philippines, for instance, the Sinoy or the Mestizo would be something that we could actually draw influences from. They could be found in Manila and in Cebu. A much earlier group would be those Minh Heng people who came down to Vietnam in the 17th century when Ming Dynasty fell. This group of political refugees moved down to Vietnam and settled down there and created a kind of distinctive hybrid communities. So I use the word hybrid to show that they were of mixed blood and so on. Then the Tayoke in Myanmar, who had mixed marriages who were the products of mixed marriages between the Chinese who came down across the border, and they have their offsprings are still can be found today. So, and in Malaya and in Indonesia, the word Peranakan is very important, and and also in Singapore as well. So you can find a lot of cultural expression mixed. Very often, very colorful weddings, photographs of weddings, and so on. Very elaborate kind of costumes being inherited to show that there were a lot of borrowing of the local Malay culture expression, especially the way the women would dress and so on. And this is reflective of the kind of hybrid communities that you can find. And of course, they also establish their organizations and so on. And if one were to actually visit, say, Malacca, or even some parts of Penang or in Jakarta, you can find a lot of the old houses being kept as museums and so on to celebrate the diversity that existed because of the infusion of the Chinese into this region. And because of such expression, such interactions, we can also find a lot of hybrid cultural expression being inherited. So the batik, the Chinese batik, of course, this recently became an issue of topic of discussion, heated discussion. But we do recognize of the fact that Chinese in Indonesia also produce their own distinctive pattern or different distinctive type of batiks with distinctive patterns and motifs and so on. In Malacca, Penang, Straits settlements, we find the Baba Nyonya actually have their own way of doing ceramic. They have infused a local culture, local motifs into the Chinese ceramics. And in Indonesia, we can see that there is these attempts to actually showcase the Chinese stories, Chinese traditional stories, like in this case, Journey to the West, Xi Yu, as in the cartoons, comics, and then it was the words, the literature were translated into the Baba Nyonya tongue. So you can see that there are also other literatures such as the Bible, New Testaments being translated into the Baba Nyonya, the straight Chinese kind of language. So here you can see there are also equivalent words. So gua as in I, lu as in you, and things like that. So here you can find that there is a very rich cultural expression that actually came out from this community. So this has been celebrated again and again through the various museums and also many of the galleries that sprang up in different parts of Southeast Asia. But then one should not be misled by the fact that this group of Chinese were the only group of Chinese that were in existence throughout this period. There were also, in fact, the majority of the Chinese have not actually intermarried. Many of them remain as Chinese, or in Indonesia, we say they were Cina Totok. they are Tianghua Totok. So we say that they are pure Chinese in a sense. So these were the people who sustained a lot of the old practices as old Chinese practices or the traditional Chinese practices as those who sustain those worship of deities, Chinese deities in places like the Cheng Hong Teng and so on. So we can see that their arrivals would depend on the kind of possibility, adventures that they could actually come out, and also depended on very much on the government policies of China at the time, whether people could actually travel abroad. And over the years, you can see that their numbers also began to decline, very small, and their migration, although continued, but very much slowed down. We are now into phase 2, the new Western enterprise and new Chinese migration. This is what I deem as what would separate the earlier phase and the second phase, phase 2. Western imperialism and colonialism that came about in the 19th century, late 18th century, resulted in a great deal of colonization of Southeast Asia. And it also brought with it Western capitalism and also Western enterprises. So we find that this kind of Western enterprises change the entire economic activities of the region. So a lot of commercial crops were planted. There were also a lot of new industry, new mining activities. So laborers were wanted, and therefore new Chinese migration also began in 1850s. So you had many of them came down as indentured labor, indentured workers on contract, while others came down on various kind of immigration schemes. So many of them were recruited via agents. Many of these agents were Chinese businessmen who were initially invited by the local rulers. For instance, in the case of Malay Peninsula, many of the Chinese businessmen were invited by the local sultan and rulers or chiefs to actually help to open up mines, tin mines especially. And for that, they use agents or use their own companies to bring down a lot of labor. And therefore, many of these were actually state-related, state-sponsored. And in the case of several cases, as we could see in the case of Sabah or in the case of the Fuzhou people, many of them were brought down via the missionary societies. And to distinguish this group of new arrivals, they were called by scholars and even by people at that time as Singkek, as in Hokkien terms means new arrivals, as opposed to those who arrived earlier. So there were a great deal of push and pull factors. The harsh lives in China, political turmoils, not the least the failure of the Taiping Rebellion in 1864 in China, and also the attractiveness of better life abroad, of people sending back money, make it very attractive for them to move abroad. So many of them move abroad and later choose to stay. And they also came in huge numbers. Some of them came via the Chinese agents, while others who have families down there actually send for their members of their own families. So many of them choose to stay. And somehow, because the numbers are huge, because also later, because women folks were allowed to emigrate, the level of mixed marriages somehow would be lower in this second phase. So you can see that I have put up here a picture of the Kadazan Dusun people. Now, this group of people have late intermarriages with the Chinese, especially in the 19th century. So you can see them coming from different, very distinctive communities as well. Some, like for instance here, a picture from the 1913 northerners from Tianjin who actually came out. This was probably the only group of northern Chinese people from north of the Yangtze River who actually came down to Southeast Asia in 1913, and they settled down in Sabah. So here you also have people like who came down a bit earlier, the Lo Fang Bo people, and whose link, whose legacy would continue to be influential to a lot of people subsequently. So they choose to stay. Many of them choose to stay, and therefore, because of that, the new settlements were open. You can find these the type of pictures that you see on this slide are quite common in different parts of Southeast Asia. You can find the term Chinatown. Now, this term is interesting because today we find them all being designated with this, clearly marked with this huge pavilion of to mark it as 中国城 or 唐人街 or things like that. So Chinatown, it basically translated as Chinatown. And so there is also some people who argue that there's no need for such pavilion because literally most of these towns were Chinese in nature. But regardless, these are very interesting permanent settlements. Of course, most of these are now in urban centers. But we also have, for instance, on the left-hand side, you find these were the new villages created during the Malayan emergencies. There were about more than 500 of them, and each of them are now a settlement, a permanent settlement of its own. And these were created in the 50s, and therefore it is interesting part of the development of the Chinese settlements, permanent settlements in the region. We can also see that this group of Chinese also brought with them new institutions like schools, organizations such as the dialect group organizations. You also find Chamber of Commerce, the assembly halls, 大会堂, 中华大会堂, and so on. So in this picture, you can see different pictures of different schools of different country. For instance, you can see that right at the left-hand corner, you find the Chinese school in Ho Chi Minh City, which is no longer a school. So this is interesting. And you can see that on top of that picture, many of the Chinese schools are now also attended by non-Chinese. In Malaysia, for instance, 80% of the school children in Chinese schools are Chinese, but 20% are not. So this is something interesting that is now developing. But we can see that, for instance, you can also see Hakka Association in different parts of the world. This is in Thailand, in Bangkok. And then you can also see Hokkien Association in Taiping and so on. So all these were permanent organizations. These were long-term organizations that were established, and you can find that find them playing very important role in promoting, in sustaining Chinese culture and Chinese distinctiveness from the local culture and so on. Another institution that's very important to the new phase of Chinese migration would be the newspaper and media. So you can find that here you have the Lat Po, which is a very early Chinese newspaper that you can find in the Straits Settlement. And here you have the Mekong Yat Po. So this is interesting. We can find that the Mekong River newspaper or daily. And you can find, of course, more recently, you have Chinese newspaper being reissued in different countries, including Indonesia, Cambodia, and even in Vietnam. So these are all very important developments that continue to sustain the Chinese presence, the Chinese distinctiveness from other communities. So by having all this organization, one could say that the Chinese that came during this second phase would be basically compartmentalized into their own sphere of influence, sphere of activities, and not mixing as much as those who came during phase one. Another one would be institutions of such as institutions of worship, temples. Chinese temples were numerous. So it's now Chinese Christians. You can find a lot of different churches. Here you can find the Church of the Emmanuel Baptist in Yangon. Here you have Fu Ying Tang, which is a Basel church in Sabah, and also here a church in Jakarta. So a lot of other types of Chinese places of worship were sustained in their own ways by the different communities. Culturally, there were also a lot of cultural, a lot of food, for instance, were actually being introduced to the region. Many of these were now being accepted and also adopted by people of different ethnic groups. So like, for instance, the Yong Tau Fu, the Hainanese chicken rice, the wonton noodle, etc. But then, other than that, one would find that the Chinese actually maintain a distinctive type of culture, distinctive type of religion that's different from the local people. Because of the fact that they were already part of this nation state, as the nation state moved towards independence, the Chinese also continue to argue that they were also contributing to the nation state. So not just during the Japanese War, as in these Philippine guerrillas, Chinese guerrillas, but later on, as the Indonesian began to talk about independence, the Chinese also said that they celebrated and they continue to support Indonesian independence. And they have also set up during the early years after the war, a Bao'an troop, meaning to say police group. And here you have the Kinta Valley Home Guard being staffed by almost entirely by Chinese to fight against the communists. And also here you have the ever recurring perennial issue about Yap Aloy, Capitan Yap Aloy's role in developing Kuala Lumpur. And of course, the all-important picture of the independence delegation to London, represented by a few Chinese. Here, at least two Chinese were identified here, H.S. Lee and T.H. Tan at the back here. So all these were Chinese way of saying that we have actually contributed to the nation building process. And therefore, we are also part of the story, part of the national narrative. But again, this story about the Chinese, about diversity, about multiculturalism, it's also a question about acceptance and also rejection, as I mentioned earlier. So there were times when you have a very huge contrast of not being accepted, as in the 1998 riots in Indonesia, but also the establishment of the museum, Chinese museum, in no less than this important place called Taman Mini Indonesia. And here, the Chinese actually put out this very interesting display of Indonesia kepadamu kami berbakti. Indonesia, to you, we dedicate ourselves. So these are all pictures of scientists, of sportsmen, and people, politicians, generals, and so on, who actually Chinese sportsmen who contributed to Indonesia. And here, museums would be an interesting place to highlight, to continue to sustain this idea that the country with the Chinese around would be much more multicultural and should be much more inclusive. So here you have the Chinese Museum in Kuala Lumpur, and this would be the Chinese Museum in Manila. So let me just briefly make a few concluding remarks. So between phase 1 and phase 2 of this Chinese migration, you can find a lot of similarities as well as a lot of differences. There were less clear line for interaction and the creation of multicultural scene was possible, especially in phase 1. But under phase 2, the lines were clearer, and especially in the context of new nation states and its expectations, and at the expense of multiculturalism, less interactions, but continue to contribute to the multicultural facet and perspective. But it remained clear that just the example of Chinese migration to Southeast Asia have offered us many examples of multicultural perspectives. But what about a multicultural perspective of history? It is still a challenge, especially in a country like Malaysia, where the writing of national history textbook, for instance, was especially challenging. It became less inclusive, and the role of the Chinese and the assistance of the Chinese were somewhat relegated and even neglected. And therefore, the idea of multicultural perspective in history has been ignored, if not neglected. And while the past clearly, as we have seen through all these pictures, images, and so on, the past clearly offered us clear example of multicultural perspectives, but they remain elusive in our understanding, in our way of building a narrative. So for the need of nation building, national narratives often done at the expense of multicultural perspective, deemed to be necessary for the need of nation building. So our task, if I may suggest, is to rescue this multicultural perspective. Thank you.